are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to our study of Traleg Kyabgon, which is desire, why it matters. And I'd like first and foremost to say that this is really a work for practitioners. There's a lot of reference to experience. And so, of course, it could be a lot of information about things that sound very theoretical. But the point really is that what we have here is a very clear and actually very straightforward exposition of how our dualistic, desiring mind operates and what to do with it. In this work, Traleg Kyabgon, he outlines desire, how it can bring us down, but at the same time also showing that for us to actually pursue the path of ridding ourselves of delusion and the delusion that causes suffering, to practice the path, we actually need desire. We need to have initiative. We need to have energy. And so we distinguish between desire that is constructive and desire that is destructive. And in this journey, the way that we're actually navigating this is very much through observing our world and how we interact with the world and how we place value on objects and also how we fixate on our own perception of the objects and how we fixate on ourselves. And in this relationship, again, it becomes clear how we can misconstrue reality and how we can see reality and how we can see ourselves much clearer. And that's where we need to understand the principle that in Buddhism we call the right and the wrong view, which of course could sound incredibly fundamentalist. You know, our side is the right side, the righteous with the right view, and those that haven't got that, they're on they belong to the others, those with the wrong view. But that's not the point. It's a very personal, intimate observation of how we misconstrue reality as something that it's not, and how we actually could begin to see reality clearly. And that's where the teaching on praticca samutpada, or dependent arising, is so important, because that's where we begin to see how things really don't have a solid identity, but they're very much, they exist in terms of being labels that we give phenomena, but they actually don't really possess an existence of their own. We're going to look into more depth of this now, but that is then really an important point for all of us, and it's not just a theoretical, philosophical project of understanding dependent arising. It's very much, you could say, something that continually challenges us, that we see things differently. We have shared perceptions, but we see things differently. And when we begin to understand that, we begin to understand how we get into trouble and how the world in general gets into trouble. So we're pursuing that. And of course, we do this with a combination of rationality. We pursue this in terms of thinking clearly, using our sense of logic, analyzing our reality. And we also are inspired because we are not just sitting there with a enlightenment DIY, sort of a self-growth project, but we actually have a living tradition of men and women who have done this. So we're in no way on our own. And that's where the much more subtle and much more really important and powerful inspiration for this transformation we're looking at takes place in the interaction and the apprenticeship with the living tradition of enlightened beings, men and women who have actually accomplished this. And so we have one example, Traleg Kyabgon himself, and also luckily, we're surrounded by great beings that embody this quality, and we're apprenticing with them. So between us undertaking this as a scientific analysis, a scientific critical study of ourself and how we pursue suffering unnecessarily, and also the inspiration we have from great teachers, we have a very powerful situation of actually, there's no reason why we shouldn't succeed. There's no reason why, with that sort of combination of hard intelligence and inspiration from living persons, that actually we have a clear path on how to proceed. So, so presently then we're in chapter 7, and this is then a chapter which is dedicated to just say some really important things about this thing that we call praticca samutpada, dependent arising or dependent origination, sometimes also understood as interconnectedness. But this is really, if you want to say what is it that's so special about the Buddhist teaching, this is really it. We sometimes say this dependent arising is the Buddha's lion's roar. So so interdependence. Now, anything that we observe, we would say, okay, there's a chair, there's a table, there's a thing, and that thing, the way we label it, very much stands in relation to its context. I, as a human, looking at a lamp, of course, I label it as a lamp, but if I was coming in from, let's say, the 8th century, then I wouldn't be able to really, I would see this in terms of my particular relationship to such strange objects. If I'm a dog, I look at it in a very different way. And the phenomenon itself really just is what it is. It doesn't actually itself think, I am a lamp. And so what we're talking about is that there's definitely a lamp. We're not denying that. And that lamp has its identity as I'm seeing it right now, its uniqueness, its thingness, which is a term Traleg Rinpoche uses, this sort of sense of a solid, real thing. Yeah, it's definitely there, but at the same time, the way that we see it is very relative to other other conditions. It's relative to my perception, and it's also something which is relative to others that might see it, how they see things. And in fact, what we have is really just an aggregation of things that in and of themselves have no sort of sense of being one thing or the other. So this is what we would call relative truth. That means that things, they are just what we say they are, conveniently. But at the same time, if we analyze, and actually the way we could distinguish between what we call relative truth and absolute truth, which of course, one is, we could say, it's the conventional reality, the other is the enlightened perspective, and that's so true. But the enlightened perspective, we begin to approach that the moment we begin to question something, the moment that we begin to analyze something, then we begin to see the complexity of things. So we would, for example, say, tell me what's William like? And of course, without any kind of much knowledge about William, we would say it's a great guy. But imagine we talk to William's wife, or we begin to talk to William's parents, or William's children. Then we'll see that William, that we initially just sort of said, yeah, that's a great guy. Then we actually see it's complex. There's many things, and the more actually we come closer to any object, the more we analyze a given phenomenon, the more we actually fail to just put a single label on it. The sort of this quality of just thing begins to dissolve, and we begin to see it's a complex web of relationships. And at the end of the day, we won't find William. in the midst of all that, which is a good thing, because what happens to us in samsara is that we begin to have likes and dislikes. And the moment we go in and see complexity, we actually back off with our simplistic conclusions. And that goes for anything. When we don't analyze, we're stuck on just the appearance, then we fail to see the reality. And we're not saying there is a reality, but it's more that we fail to see that things really just exist in relationship. They don't actually have an identity of their own. And that's so important. So the sage is not as if the sage knows the secret, but it's more that the sage doesn't fall into this trap of just labeling things good, bad, and then having likes and dislikes and all of that. So this is where this insight of interdependence is immensely important. So the uniqueness of anything stands in relation to other things. So this lamp is very much constructed by, metal, wood, sort of the cloth of the lampshade, the electricity, and so forth. And none of these things in and of themselves contain, you could say, what we call lamp. So it's important to see that our perception of a thing stands in relation to its context. Here, this shining thing occupies space as a lamp. So what we understand is that nothing arises independently. There's nothing that in and of itself is in one particular way. And that will save us a lot of grief. And that's we call it the correct view. How we personally see things is often mixed up with shared public perception. So of course, I'll say lamp, so will you, table, and so on. But the moment that we begin to have this vision of interdependence, what we call right view, we don't get too stuck. If somebody comes in here and they've never seen a lamp before, and they say, that's a spear, an electric spear, we can go, yeah, the sage won't say, no, it's a lamp. It'll say, oh yeah, I guess it's an electric spear, That kind of openness, broad-mindedness, lack of narrowness is what we could call right view. And you see, that's where, despite its name, right view actually is, initially we have the view of interdependence that enables that, but it'll take us into a space of a wide view that goes beyond view. So we fixate less when we have that, and we see more. We begin to become more sort of, we get the jokes better. We begin to appreciate more aspects that we hadn't seen. So that's why fixation is on the path to freedom and on the path to happiness. Now, for us to do that, to get to that place, that's where we really are not just adopting a new set of dogmas, the right view dogmas, but it's actually we're dismantling our dogmatic self altogether. That's where meditation is so important. Traleg Kyabgon says, as the first step, we try to get used to that notion through meditation. Through developing mindfulness and awareness in meditation, we become aware of we become aware of how our minds grasp onto and fixate on things. This has to be followed up by the practice of vipassana, insight meditation, coupled with an understanding of pratitya samutpada, dependent arising, which is what vipassana is about. So when we sit down to meditate, we allow the mind to be present. We actually have the structure there for us not to be caught up in the usual distracted condition. So we're not really introducing anything particular with the practice of meditation. We're just allowing ourselves to actually be present. And that's where we can see the mind is sort of dying to go to some object and occupy itself and, develop an opinion. But that's where we then have this practice of mindfulness and awareness that enables us to come back to being present. Now, when we have that presence and that clarity of mind, if we then have that insight, if we had the information, the dependent arising, that's where we begin to see, hey, the way that we label things rigidly is actually a mistake. So it's not just as with meditation that we calm down, but it's actually a place where we recognize, yeah, that's right. That's right. The way that I grasp, pigeonhole, diminish phenomena, that's actually not how they are. So that openness then is facilitated by having had some insight about, or some teaching or some knowledge of pratitya samutpada, and this then facilitates vipassana, greater perspective. So as far we situate this insight within the notion of self and the skandhas. So this of course applies to everything. And where our initial confusion originates, that is from the point of view of this mind, this self. And that's where we need to look at that self that gets itself all tangled up in confusion. And that's where, in all the Buddhist traditions, we look at how self is essentially confused. And that's why we look at the skandhas, we look at the sense of self, and we can see, this is where actually the whole thing begins. This sort of solidification of self with its likes and dislikes, its narratives, impulses, its moods, its sense of identity, and so on. And so when we begin to look in, it's not just that we find you could say a genealogy or a history of the ego, but it's also that we see it's made up of, it's complex, and there is actually nothing there that we can ultimately say is a self. We really just have a set of conditions that together fabricate or seem to be a self. The paradox is that it's changing all the time, and it's made up of many different things. So we actually have no real reason to assert this uptightness around the self that we do. So it's with the insight into the skandhas that we begin to see the dependent nature of the self. So that means there is nothing unique or essential in the self. Essential here in the sense of just being one little knot that is me. We can't find it. It's complex. There's consciousness, there's perceptions, there's moods, there's thoughts, there's narratives, there's a sense of gaining and losing, there's a sense of like and dislike. Our consciousness is complex, but when we look at the skandhas, that's where we begin to then just very scientifically begin to identify what exactly it is that we're doing. And that's where we arrive at the conclusion that we are composed. Certainly, we have body and consciousness, but we're not as if we're either one or the other. So you can't say that the body is physical, yet the body is physical. Sorry, that's I'm still struggling with the English language. I think it's supposed to say the physical body. Um, uh, the body is physical, yet it's not inanimate matter, right? So it's not just the heap. The Traleg Kyabgon talks about bembo, which means something that is just stuff, matter. We're very, very sensitive with our body. It feels pain and pleasure. So consciousness, likewise, is also many things. We can't just say there's one consciousness. There's all the time. Every moment your consciousness is hearing a new word. We're constantly being constructed due to the impressions that we get. And so this consciousness also has a sense of self, the whole thing around me, and also the objects. So the being that we are is composed of both the physical and the mental. Traleg Kyabgon says, if we think of the mind as unitary, then we have separated our mind from our body, and they then become unitary aspects. This position creates a separation between body and mind, which is an example of the wrong view. The right view recognizes that the body and mind both have many different elements. For example, when we have feelings, experience our cognitive capacity, have memories, and so on, all experiences and manifestations come together as mind. So we can see body is many different things, as we clearly can see, and mind are many different things, memories, impressions, and so on. Now, why we're doing all of this is because our mistake is we solidify, we jump onto conclusions about things and fixate when actually reality is not like that. So we have less fixation with an understanding of our aggregated nature. That's why we study the skandhas. That's why we study dependent arising, madhyamika, prajnaparamita, and so on. And what we take with us from these studies is this continual questions, or rather, we continually question the labels me and mine. Meaning, I take myself so seriously, I take mine so seriously. It's easy for us to laugh at when others are kind of a little bit over obsessive with their things, but we do it all the time in less or greater degree, you know. Look at our bank statement. Where did that money go? My money, where did it go? So Traleg Rinpoche says, this whole sense of me, this is me in relation to what? Because if we look, we are many different things. We're me as one person in one context, another person in another context. And it's not as if we're supposed to come up with the right answer, like, oh, it is all emptiness, No, that's not the point. It's more that we begin to dismantle the rigidity and uptightness around this me. So, this is me in relation to what? What will I find? It really changes all the time. So, presently, as far as our body goes, then we have the conditions there. Similarly, also there's a body that's here just because there's a few conditions that have come together. But this is something that's as a result of being a conditioned thing that has no essence. There's no durable essence. If there was, then it would never change. But because it's conditional, it's subject to change. So as long as certain conditions are there, we're alive, we have this life. So what we want to do, and where it is that this is not just philosophy, it's actually that we live this. We take this with us, not as like, oh yeah, the Buddhists, we believe. That's not the point. The point is we continually question and observe the labels that we give to our body and our mind. And we see how we actually solidify these labels as being real. And so to observe and question, that helps us to begin to penetrate this myth that we are continually operating with. And why we do this, it is helpful to see the problem with fixating on ourselves, because if we look, we can see the more we fixate on ourselves, the more uptight we are, the more we suffer. Traleg Rinpoche says, to overcome fixation, the monastics and the lay practitioners need to overcome that misunderstanding and recognize the self or the mind, the body, and the world as being interdependent. The mind is dependent on the body is dependent on the mind and body are dependent on the world. The world, in turn, is not so very different from the physically embodied individual, because the individual is connected to the physical environment, mentally, socially, physically, and in other ways. Developing that perspective helps to correct the wrong view that things exist in isolation. So the way that we see ourselves is dependent on a number of conditions that have to do with our body, our mind, and similarly also the way we perceive the world. It's not that there is a world out there independent of us. It's us who are constructing or projecting the world in a particular way. And this actually even changes from moment to moment. Our perception of body, mind, and the world, they're continually changing due to just being constructs. And they are they as phenomena in and of themselves, they don't have any solidity. You can say they're empty phenomena for sure. They're dependent phenomena. But we impute the error. The error lies in us attributing solidity to things. And that's where, like Traleg Rinpoche has been pointing out, it's so helpful that we begin to question this. Chapter 8, where samsara resides. So this is quite funny because, of course, we know that samsara is the realm of suffering, it's a realm of delusion, but we sometimes think it's like a place. We sometimes tend to think, well, the world is samsara, or if we've been in retreat, you come out from retreat and people say, oh, now you're back in samsara, as if there's some sort of retreat hut that's not samsara. As anybody who does retreat, anybody doing practice, you'll know that there's plenty of samsara happening on the meditation cushion in your in your retreat hut. And the point is that samsara is not the objects themselves. Phenomena are in and of themselves pure. We have a lot of beautiful terms for the nature of reality, the expanse or the space of reality, the body of truth, and so forth. Reality is in itself, there's no problem with reality. The problem is samsara, the way that we begin to misinterpret reality. Now, speaking about desire, we can see, yes, desire is potentially a problem, but the thing is also that desire in and of itself, that is also not, that is also just a label for some practices of fixating, grasping, which in and of themselves also are innocent conditions of just confusion. So it's all compounded, and so there is no such a thing as desire as something that's solid or something that is, there's some sort of chip in us that's a desire. And we've already looked at desire can be many different things. It can be something that's very helpful. It can be something that's not very helpful. So that really depends on the context, the attitude. Again, it's about the subject. It's about us. So we're not going in there as we're going to blow up desire. We're going to get rid of desire. It's more that it's a bit like something that only really holds us if it's not looked at. The moment that we look at desire and we're aware of it, it actually doesn't have any power over us. It's something that festers in the dark of ignorance. When we sort of don't want to know about samsara, if we repress it, if we don't want to know about desire and we sort of just keep it aside, we don't want to know about it, repress it, and pretend it's not there, talk about something else, then it gains strength. It becomes the black dog that we sort of live in fear of. Whereas if we face it, it's actually something that, as anything, is a dependent phenomena. It exists in relationship. It exists to the extent that we react to it. Traleg says, we may think of desire in a very black and white way. That is, we can either abandon desire altogether or have a very positive attitude towards it as if there's no real problem with it. Both approaches are wrong insofar as these are forms of fixation. It would be completely in tune with Buddhism, then, if we did not fixate on the concept of desire as something to be either cultivated or rejected, but rather try to understand the nature and complexity of desire so that we can correct some misconceptions and misunderstandings about it. What we're saying here is that the quality, you could say the fiery, warm quality of desire that happens, it's about how it gets, you could say, hooked up to particular agendas. If it's hooked up to self, it can become something that becomes very small. If it's hooked up to what we call bodhicitta, then it becomes something very vast. So in and of itself, the energy is not neither good nor bad, but in that we begin to see it and we begin to look, that's where we can begin to that desire becomes something that we can integrate on the path. It's not something that in and of itself is a problem. For us to engage in the path, and that's where we're beginning to deviate, or we're beginning to move away from the destructive patterns of desire, there has to be some sense of determination to be free. And that's what we refer to as renunciation. The Buddhist path is founded on renunciation. But what we should understand about renunciation is that it's not seen as an absolute. The implication of of renunciation is more that we're determined to pursue the path without distraction. And that needs to be there no matter how tantric we might be or how Mahayanist and lovingly we might be. It's all tied up with this foundation of determination to break free of delusion. So renunciation is really essential for the entire Buddhist path, but we have to understand that as much as it sounds as turning our back on something, it's anything but that. It is not about turning away from the world. It's about getting down to the bottom of what drives samsara, getting down to the bottom of what drives suffering. Buddhists do not see the world as a bad place, as the devil's playground, like the world being a bad place. All people are essentially sinners, and the world is sort of a a den of vice. But it's the idea of samsara does not exist in the world. It's about our perceptions. So when we develop and pursue the path, this is about pursuing the project of truth, of breaking through delusion. And in order to do so, then renunciation very often is tied up with a particular lifestyle of simplicity, where the monastics, they live away from the world, where they're celibate, where they've given up a lot of the entanglements of the world. But these kind of practices, such as, for example, celibacy, this is really more about just practical measures. We've looked at that in an earlier chapter also. It's not that the world and the non-celibate practices in and of themselves are evil. It's more what they tend to bring with them, the ways that we, our value systems and so forth, the way that we fixate, obsess, and pursue the objects of desire and so forth, that then brings entanglement. But in and of itself, it's not as if the desire that drives the libido and the sort of general desire for worldly occupations and so forth, that in and of itself is a problem. It's more the entanglement that comes with it. So Traleg Kyabgon says, in Buddhism, the problem is not seen to be with the world. The problem lies in our response to the world and our relationship with our experiences. Therefore, practitioners, be they laity or monastic, train in how to understand themselves better so that they will not respond to the world in a negative way and continue to experience the misery of samsara. Samsara is seen as existing in the mind. Samsara is not the world taken as a whole. Samsara is in the mind and of the individual because of our sensory experiences, deep-seated habits, strong emotions, and the delusory mental states that we're immersed in. As a result, from the moment of our birth, it's very difficult for us to engage with the world properly and fully. So the paradox is, because of our confusion, we're not really properly worldly people. The more we have renunciation, the more we have wisdom, the more we actually become worldly, the more we actually begin to know the world for what it is. So carried away by our fixation on invalid assumptions and emotions, we're lost in samsara. So this is where delusion is what really creates samsara. And because we don't really have an idea where we're going and so forth, and on the basis of our confusion and assumptions and so forth, and all the emotions, the afflicted, toxic impulses, then we drive our own suffering. And so it's not just that we're sort of innocently lost, but we're actually painfully lost. And that's where, again and again, we try to hold on to things that we think are going to bring us happiness, but they're really just like if we were in the middle of a river being dragged away by the torrent, then holding on to a piece of driftwood is not going to really help us. So this is where these kind of short moments of having objects that we think is going to bring us happiness is not at all going to help us. And these are really just projections of our confusion that have no real benefit. So in order to deal with this, and this of course is what we're talking about all the time in terms of how we actually practically deal with this, we slow down, we begin to allow the mind to be less confused, and we begin to see the mind clearly. That's what we do with meditation. We see clearer with mindfulness and awareness, and that's where we reduce our fixation and grasping. So as we practice mindfulness and awareness, then the mind naturally settles. And that just by settling, then there's less being seduced by and carried away by our ordinary fixations and ordinary ideas. So from the start, and that here we're referring to the Buddhist path, yeah, we're encouraged to observe and see what the mind is doing. So it's not as if we enter the path and then we have to do all sorts of things before we actually begin to really get to the bottom of it. We actually, right from the start, get to the bottom of it. And that's why we, from the start of the Buddhist path, are encouraged to not be deceived, not be fooled by our habitual patterns. So right from the start, then, we're developing this critical muscle with regards to our deception, our self-deception. Traleg just says, as we relax the tendency to grasp on to our mental activity within meditation, we find this filters through to our post-meditation. The next time we see something that would normally overwhelm or overpower us, we can find that the intensity of our fixated response has lessened. Thus, the mind is less disturbed. So we meditate, but it's not as if meditation is something that's just about the period that we meditate. Meditation is not a place we go in and then we recharge our batteries because the world is a dreadful place. Rather, meditation is where we begin to see clearly. We begin to see the nature of our reality, and that we bring with us as we exit meditation and engage with that reality. So Vipassana meditation is never ever something about retreating into a place of sort of a special place, and then we come out of meditation, it's all different. It's rather that meditation enables us to operate more fully and more clearly in the so-called post-meditation. Now, what we discover that we do is that our mind, it singles out things that we then find desirable, interesting, and we kind of get this tunnel vision where we lose perspective. And this is also something that is talked about in quantum physics, actually, that reality is really a realm of possibility. It's only when we begin to fixate that we have this thing we call quantum breakdown, where the object attains its identity, but only on the basis of an observer. And this is exactly the same thing we say in the Buddhist teaching also, where the phenomenon really only is seen or exists in terms of us fixating in a particular way. And that's where we cease to see the constructed nature of a phenomenon, and instead we just label it good, bad, this, that, and so forth. So consequently, our vision and experience is distorted and we react out of proportion. So we're never really seeing our reality properly when we engage in this fixation. And so we're not seeing reality properly, and also we begin to act neurotically. We react with likes and dislikes that have nothing to do with the objects themselves. And this is based on us actually just not seeing clearly. We have a distorted vision. So the samsaric mind lacks awareness. It's something that sort of prevents us from actually relating properly to the world. It closes us down. And so what we want to do with the path is then practice mindfulness, practice meditation. So while the samsaric mind lacks awareness and closes us down, then mindfulness is something that opens us up. And that's what basically we're doing when we practice meditation, is opening. It's connecting with the world, connecting with reality, opening up, discontinuing the processes that diminish us. So the focus of mindfulness, the fact that we're not tagging along with our self-deception, This enables us to be free of grasping and fixation. So the more that we're connecting and develop a greater openness, we fixate and grasp less. Traleg says, initially when we begin to this practice, we can try a form of self-talk, engaging in a type of monologue to assist us. Well, just let it pass. Don't dwell on it. Don't get too worried. Don't get too worked up or take it too seriously. This way, the next time a strong emotion or disturbing thought arises, it is less likely we will be perturbed by it. We will be less fixated and will not grasp onto that thought or emotion. So, as we begin, then we establish a view that understand that the value that we attribute to things might not actually be founded on any reality, but then we also we can speak to ourselves and just, remind ourselves. There's two methods of meditation, shamatha or tranquility meditation, and vipassana or analytical meditation. The first, shamatha, is about establishing peace. It's about establishing calm. And within that calm, then we begin to see clearly, which is then vipassana. And that's then aided with analysis, that we actually look and cut through our deception through applying what we call prajna, or this quality of intelligence or wisdom. So both shamatha and vipassana, they involve mindfulness and awareness. They both involve that we're actually here, that we're present. And in vipassana, we learn to see dependent arising and be free of thoughts and emotions, in the sense that we begin to see where it is that we're fooled. So vipassana has to do with analysis and seeing clearly. So the first really, but then again, unless we actually have a foundation of shamatha, then us seeing clearly, it really just amounts to just more ideas. We could be very learned in all sorts of Buddhist philosophy, but unless we practice, then it doesn't actually take hold of us. So we need to have this context, this ground of shamatha, mindfulness and awareness. So what arises in our mind, and this of course is all along, is not something that we reject. It's about us. So it's not about us beginning to develop strategies about what happens in our mind. It's just that we begin to observe and see things. And what fixation is, this cause of our delusion, is simply a failure to see the interconnected nature of things. So when we begin to see that this hand is not just a hand in the sense of just being one thing, but it's actually made up of many, many, many different things. And because it's conditional, then also we can see there's nothing ultimately that we can fixate on. So that's where the value of understanding interdependence is so important. It's really what enables us to see how fixation leads to our deception. So that's where we fixate when we don't really understand, or we don't understand things properly for what they are. So when we fail to see things, when we fail to see their dependent or conditional or interconnected nature, then we begin to have, oh yeah, we take sides. Oh, that's good, that's bad. And that's why we end up seeing things in a distorted way. It's so easy for us to see how that happens. Right now, of course, there's a lot of discussion around Black Lives Matter. There's a lot of seeing how delusion has driven a lot of the policies, the cultural practices, and so forth for a very long time. So it's very easy to see from the outside how this is a way that we distort reality. But it's not just about us engaging in a political fight, even though, of course, we should. But it's also about understanding where did that come from in the first place, and really getting down to what's the systemic problem or the cause of this. And so that's where we when we engage in the path, we do so with an awareness that this is really getting to the bottom of things. So when we are delusional, when we have these, in this failure to see the nature of things, and we have likes and dislikes and so on, and have that distortion, then we're lost, and we no longer are present in an aware and intelligent way. We rather we perpetuate and follow these kind of samsaric patterns. And it doesn't help to say, oh yeah, well, it's normal, it's normal to have this and it's normal to have that, because yes, and that's exactly why all sentient beings, they suffer. So these habitual samsaric patterns, they might be very common, but for us to actually eliminate suffering, we need to revise our habitual patterns. And it's also understanding how others are held by this delusion, that we can begin to actually be there for others. That's where, of course, our awareness of the world around us begins to become a caring and an empathy and possess a quality of compassion. So Traleg says, in meditation, we can encounter and recognize what is going on in the mind in a less grasping and fixated manner. In a less grasping and fixated way, instead of singling out a particular thought and focusing on our mind on that. This is jealousy, or this is joy, or this is anger. From the perspective of Vipassana, we can observe the activity in the mind in relation to the different forms the mind can take, trying to see the interconnected panorama of experience, inclusive of the different forms of the mind. So when we look at the mind, we see that it does these various, it reacts and it operates in particular dynamic patterns where we have particular impulses and so forth, but the more that we actually understand the conditions around this, we're less held by this. We're less held by the impulses and the fixation. So on the path, it's not a question of us shutting down the display of our mind or body. It's more actually of us coming in touch with it and beginning to experience it. So it's about us experiencing more fully, and as Traleg says, more fully, more properly. But what we do, which is different from just tagging along unconsciously, is that we observe the movement of body and mind while remaining open, without fixation. So that's where instead of going in, we actually open up. Applying mindfulness and awareness enable us to see our relationship to the world. So this is something where, quite simply, the practice of meditation is not about removing ourselves from the world, but engaging. We analyze the origins of the movement and recognize our connection with things. So when we look at what the mind is doing, we can see this has to do with us having our likes and dislikes and so forth. And that's where we begin to then see what the mind is doing, and we're less deceived, we're less taken aback. What we're seeing is dependent arising, praticca samutpada. And when we see that, we see the absence of solidity of things, we can still appreciate the appearance or the horizon, meaning we can still see things. A lamp is still a lamp, a table is still a table. But yet we also understand that it doesn't actually have a reality in and of itself. So this has to do with what we experience with outer objects, and also has to do with what we experience in ourselves. We're not talking about stopping ourselves in being what we are, but it's more that we're not deceived by the arisings of the mind. So that's where we recognize how experiences and perceptions, they arise, they're there for a while, and then they come to an end. They have no inherent solidity. So we have this example, Traleg gives this example of a piece of furniture, the chest of drawers, and how we can analyze it. We can analyze the thing itself, we can analyze our reactions to it, and also the process of if we acquire it and our changing of perceptions. Traleg says, from the Buddhist point of view, trying to understand things in this way is not just a vain intellectual exercise. If we begin to think about many other things in this way as well, it will give us insight into a more inclusive understanding of and a connection to how things arise and dissipate. So this is not about philosophy, this is about getting to the bottom of what we're doing. So extracting ourselves from delusion is not otherworldly, it is seeing clearly. It's interesting that sometimes people, they would think that that a lama or a yogi or a swami or a meditator is kind of in a different world. And like they would say things like, well, you probably don't do this, or you probably don't think this, or you probably don't, as if they have chosen to turn their back on the world. But that's not the case. It's actually there's less likes and dislikes. There's simply just an engaging, a more full engagement with the world. So they're definitely not otherworldly. It's questionable whether or not it's us who are otherworldly and the sage who is, you could say, worldly. So as a renunciant, we see the world properly. We become truly worldly persons. As we become determined not to get caught up in our deception, we begin to be more clear on what is actually going on. We become worldly, and worldly, it also means discerning. We become clever. We become clear on what there is. So see the way things appear, arise. When we see the way things appear, arise, and cease, we connect more fully with the world. We're not just selecting and distorting reality, we're actually seeing it in a wider context. So, being more in tune with the world, we will be happier. The more that we understand the world for what it is, we don't really have so many problems with it. We're more in sync with the nature of the world. So we're happier. There's less disappointment, less frustration. Traleg says, in terms of our internal mental world and the external physical world, there will then be some kind of correspondence, a more harmonious relationship between the two. A monastic, lay practitioner or renunciant comes to understand that both in the internal world of the mental experience and the external world of sensory experience, nothing remains the same. As we recognize that nothing remains the same, we find it more difficult to fixate on a given form, say, as we know that form will change. As we looked at before, we crave security. We try to hold on to something that might give us some sense of safety. So we grasp onto things that inevitably will change, such as love, wealth, power. And this is again like these pieces of driftwood that we try to hold on to as we're being swept away by the current. But this is an attempt to secure ourselves, but these things themselves, they're changing, as are we. So the Buddha, of course, in some way understands this need for stability or this need for safety. And that's, of course, why the Buddha is the refuge. There's a place we can find safety. But that has not to do with finding something where we can just forever just go on being how we are habitually. We actually, to find safety, we need to begin to work with ourselves. And that's where we need to dismantle confusion. And that's where we find safety. And that's why the Buddha taught us how we can achieve stability in the midst of everything that's changing. How? Well, it's not going to be about something that we hold on to. Rather, it's the opposite. It's about us stopping to hold on to things, discontinuing this failed practice of holding on to things, where we then begin to have the peace that takes into account the ever-changing nature of things. And that's where, with us remaining without fixation, then we begin to have some sense of safety, stability. So the point is, we have no power to change the nature of the world, but we can gain stability within. So like we looked at last time or the time before, this quote from Shantideva, where it's not we're not going to be comfortable. We could think that we need to change the world by covering it in leather, but the same is achieved actually by just covering our feet. And so similarly also, we can find this safety at all times through having this stability from within. And that is not something that comes about through wishful thinking or just signing up in the right, you know, associating with the right church or the right spiritual movement, but it's something that comes from us working with ourselves. So it's gained through meditation, as in awareness and mindfulness, shamatha, and understanding reality, as in vipassana. Traleg Kyabgon says, non-grasping produces a sense of stability that diffuses desperation. There is no impetus for us to become frantic and frenzied. In that way, we can develop a fundamental sense of equilibrium within, despite all the goings-ons of life, both internally and externally. On a personal level, I've had the privilege to spend some time with Tibetans at a time when it was not that, it was just a little over a decade since they had left Tibet, and yet there were so many great practitioners who had undergone horrific things. At the time, I didn't even know so much of the horrific sort of things that happened, and there was continually this sense of peace and joy that was just a natural part, not only actually with the practitioners, but also with the Tibetan community at large. With this very much from this sense of having the ultimate nature of reality is not understood in terms of whether you're getting what you want from the outside world, but very much having an anchor in terms of um, understanding the, the 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 value of the undiluted mind, and understanding that that undiluted mind is innate to all of us and is something that can be cultivated. And of course, also having, you could say, beacons of enlightenment, of hope, leading the communities. Many great masters who were the leaders of these communities. So in that sense, the the um, the value of this is manifest in the example of men and women in our world. Of course, not just not only the Tibetans, but of course also other places. We see this, and it's sort of universally recognized. It is not just the external world that is in flux. Our skandhas are forever changing. So the world outside is changing, we're changing. With the right view and practicing mindfulness and awareness, we will have stability. We will find this unconditional ground that is no longer fooled by fixation. And doing that, then, in this way, we will progress on the path. Traleg Kyabgon says, in summary, the first way to overcome grasping is to practice mindfulness and awareness. The second way is to correct the wrong view with the right view, which comes from understanding how the world is and from the understanding of the 5 psychophysical constituents, while seeing the interconnected nature of all things. So the psychophysical constituents, meaning the 5 skandhas. So we practice meditation, we gain the right view, and we begin to see then the dependent arising nature of all things. As far as this process is concerned, then understanding is not enough. We need to have experience. So going beyond mere understanding is what is meant with going beyond the view. This we've looked at before. So we have initially an understanding, then we begin to have some experience, and then ultimately, when we have genuine stability, we go beyond even the view. So when we talk about going beyond the view, this is where we have to let go of fixation. Oh, sorry, this is where we have let go of fixation. When we talk about realization, this is where we're entirely free. The realized person is not somebody that's continually remembering what they've been taught, but these are persons that are free, even from the free, even from the nature of the path, even from the nature of the view. So we recognize that we suffer from grasping, and so we remedy this condition with the shamatha and vipassana, and this enables then a deeper understanding that brings about realization. And then ultimately, realization is not a place where we are thinking about the truth, rather we embody the truth. So we see this in sages. To convert understanding into, Traleg says, to convert understanding into direct insight, we need to make a distinction between understanding and insight or realization. The difference between them is that understanding is conceptual, even though it also can contain some insight, whereas true insight is non-conceptual, as is realization. When one directly experiences the true nature of things, it can be described as embodying the teaching, as if one is breathing life into the theory. And that's such a true way of putting it, breathing life into the theory, because this theory is great, but the moment it's embodied and living in somebody, then it truly possesses a living quality. Going beyond view is common across all the traditions of Buddhism. So it's not just some traditions that we say, just let it all be or whatever. It's not that there is that's particular to some traditions. It's something that everywhere is understood as being the nature of what is realization. So with mindfulness awareness, then as we approach this practically, it is about us slowing our mind down. And in doing so, we become sensitive to how the mind responds and reacts to the situations that we find ourselves in. And when we have this clarity and are not necessarily held by the reactions of the mind, we can respond to the arisings of emotions in a less agitated way. We are less fearful of what we contain, and we're also more sensitive to the potential brilliance that is behind this movements of the mind. And also there's more appreciation of the environment or the object, the world around us. So this means we'll experience more fully and without the bother of afflictions. It means as we're practicing and we're beginning to have more openness, we're more connected, then we begin to have a greater sense of the texture, the color, the atmosphere, and a stronger awareness of both ourselves and others. Traleg says, this approach promotes calmness in the face of internal and external turmoil. Calming the mind provides us with a space and perspective to look at mind's activity and responsiveness, thus bringing into being more understanding and insight into the reactive and obsessive tendencies of the mind. So we just begin to understand what's happening within ourselves, and we are less caught by it. But there's a big difference between that being a moralistic proposition and then actually doing this from a point of view of working organically with our temperament and our impulses. And that's where meditation again is so important. Because if we're just saying ourselves, if we say to ourselves, I'm going to practice not being attached, I'll be less fixated, it's just ideas. But to actually feel it, or rather to experience this, we need really the context of sitting and beginning to be clear on what's happening in the mind, conscious of what's happening in the mind. So emptiness, or this seeing of arising and ceasing of phenomena, in early Buddhism is also emptiness in early Buddhism is also often referred to as arising and cessation, or insubstantiality. So in the Mahayana, we talk a lot about the unity of dependent arising and emptiness. And this also is present within the early Buddhist traditions, where this then is referred to as the arising of things that also inevitably lead to their cessation. So phenomena don't have an ultimate substance. But when we begin to see that also that this lack of substance, it indicates that there is no essence, then it doesn't matter if it's the mind or the objective world, we see that there's nothing that we can actually grasp about it. And that's where we speak about emptiness. When we have insight into emptiness, that's where this enables us to have that that perspective where we can let go of grasping and fixation. When we let go of grasping and fixation, we begin to see the appearances clearer. It's not like we go into some sort of void space of just clear light or nothing whatsoever. It's rather that with less grasping and fixation, we begin to be more sensitive to and appreciate the nature of things. And that's where we discontinue. We stop doing this thing of just freezing things. And that's where it's about us beginning to open up, and this counters our tendency to see things as inert and inflexible. So this is something that opens us up to reality, and for this reason, then, this teaching is really the most important teaching of the Buddha. Like Traleg Kyabgon says, this was the greatest gift the Buddha gave to the world, this pratitya samutpada. And again, later, then, the teaching was further clarified by the great philosopher Nagarjuna at a time when there was some tendency towards beginning to assert something that could be grasped and so on. Then the Nagarjuna was really important in clarifying the Buddha's teachings and bringing home this point about how there's nothing really that we can fixate or grasp. Traleg Kyabgon says our tendency to see the world differently from how it actually exists means we get fixated on the thingness of things, like the tableness of the table, or the chairness of the chair, or the mountainness of the mountain. By fixating the mind on the tableness or chairness, we see that as something very definite, as if the concept itself is solid, is real, existing by itself, as it were. And that is the wrong conception. So of course the chair functions as a chair, but to actually give it some sort of like identity, that's where we begin to elaborate or place our concepts onto things in a way that they actually don't possess. We are exaggerating things. So when we speak of emptiness of objects, it means that phenomena, anything that we perceive, including also ourself and our skandhas and the world around us, it's empty of thingness. The thing that we're referring to, the table or the self or the lamp or whatever it might be, that's only a conventional construction. It's a label. So labels, of course, lamp, table, me, they're part of our linguistic practice, but they don't actually reflect the reality of things. So in the Mahayana view, there is no fixed thingness that we can hang on to. So that's an important point, that in the Mahayana we're clear that we don't try to hold on to anything, however minute in terms of object, however subtle in terms of the mind. So we assign qualities and features to objects, but that is merely mental imputations, and we might agree on it. Me calling the table, that's my trip. But you might have the same trip. So you might agree with me that that is a table. The table itself is not sitting there thinking, I'm a table, you know? And it's just conventions. They're language games. And so these are ways that we just refer to things. But they exist within a context of just conventions. Here to your right, you have the mother Prajna Paramita, which is then the way that we represent this quality of wisdom that is not confused. So this is this is the mother, the great mother Prajna Paramita, and we say this is the mother that gives birth to all the Buddhas. This is the mother that enables enlightenment. This insight that we're discussing here, this is what will give rise to enlightenment. Could this be discussed in terms of the four dharmas of Gambopa, especially the third and fourth? Very much, very much. Actually, everything we're doing here could be understood in terms of the four dharmas of Gambopa. Bless me that my mind may turn to the Dharma. We've discussed that, right? We're turning away from fixation. Bless me that my Dharma may progress along the path. Well, that's what we're doing in terms of shamatha, vipassana, etc. Bless us that the path may clarify confusion. Well, that's very much, I guess we could say, gaining the quality of the view and so forth, and no longer being deceived. And bless us that confusion may dawn as wisdom. That is then where there's the realization in which the natural movements of the mind arise as wisdom. So yes, this is very much the four dharmas of Gambopa. I think they they can be applied everywhere. Okay. So just the last paragraph from this chapter. Traleg Kyabgon says, realizing that does not only, and here referring to dependent arising and emptiness, realizing that does not only give us intellectual understanding of how things are or how things work. In fact, recognizing how much influence and impact our conceptual activity, attraction, aversion, like, dislike, and so on, has on what we experience, has a transformative effect on us. We need not grasp at things so tenaciously. So when we see a table or chair or some other object, any strong emotions and feelings that may arise associated with that object and created by our mind may not be as forceful or as frequent. So what we're looking at here is something that makes a lot of sense in terms of logic, in terms of us having something to think about, and reflecting about, you could say, the tension between how we habitually see things and how we actually, if we look and think about it, how things actually are. And so that gives us intellectually some very interesting perspectives on reality. But it does also more than that, because when we then become biased, bigoted, attached, aggressive, greedy, and so forth, on the basis of our imputing this solidity on phenomena, we begin to sort of go, hey, what am I doing here? And so that's where we actually, there is a transformation that begins to take place. So when we have that and we carry that with us, merely the idea itself will benefit us in terms of transformation. But if we combine this with the practice of meditation, if we combine these two aspects of shamatha and vipassana, then this is something that really takes hold within our mind. And there's then the possibility that our mind might loosen up, and the habitual patterns that ordinarily hold us so strongly, they might not be so forceful, not so frequent. Is it then about reducing the intensity of the feeling, whether grasping or aversion, rather than attempting to negate or undo the feeling completely? That's partly the answer. But you know, this, what Traleg Kyabgon is very much emphasizing here is beginning to understand the object that we have strong feelings about. Because we reducing the intensity of the feeling won't take place as long as we still think that that object that we're all excited about is real. So yes, if we have the method clear on how to reduce the intensity of the feeling, then we're getting it right. But that is what Traleg Kyabgon is trying to say here, is that that's about us understanding understanding the object that we're excited about, and also understanding where it is that we fixate. So through these methods, then we will reduce the intensity of the feeling. So above all, this is about us observing ourselves and understanding the nature of um, the external objects, and objects, of course, also include, cats and dogs and humans, the living things. But it's about us beginning to understand what phenomena are, and also understanding what we are. So once we understand that, then we're more open, and we're less likely to go into this tunnel vision. So when we have that, then the struggle is less. And then the sort of the methods that we sometimes have, we kind of negate things, or we try to undo the feeling, or whatever. They're not really, they come naturally, or rather they're not even needed. The main thing is, yes, you're right, they're just about reducing the intensity, but that reduction of intensity is something we achieve through insight, through understanding. And that's what we mean with the correct view. That's what we mean with vipassana. That's what we mean with opening up, and so forth. Mm-hmm. Okay. No other questions? Okay, good. Yeah, it's a privilege really to be looking at this work here by Traleg Kyabgon. Yeah, and it seems to be some of Rinpoche's own students here, so it's a joy to study together with you. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom, and attain the two supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom. Next time, we're going to finish the first section of the book, part 1. So that's the last chapter of the section 1 is going to be chapter 9, correcting our misapprehensions of the world. And then we're going to start part 2, Abhidharma, the psychology of meditation. And there we read then chapter 10, many elements combine to create experience. So we'll look at that for next time. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.